The Zorvans launched their first wave of attacks with unmatched confidence. Certain that the superior technology and advanced weaponry of their fleets would bring swift victory, their ships descended upon Earth with unrelenting speed and precision. Massive, sleek warships brimming with power emerged from the void of space, crossing the stars in mere hours. As their fleets entered Earth's atmosphere, the world trembled. It was a spectacle of destruction, a terrifying and unrelenting barrage of laser beams, plasma bolts, and shockwaves. The air hummed with the sound of weapons of war never before seen on Earth, and entire cities crumbled under the might of the Zorvan attack. The skies themselves seemed to burn with the flames of war. The Zorvans had no need for subtlety. Diplomacy was a concept they did not entertain. Their mission was simple: conquest. Earth had long been observed, deemed primitive by their standards, and its resources were valuable. The Zorvans sought to claim this planet as their own, extinguishing any trace of humanity in their path. There was no negotiation, no attempt to understand or communicate with the people of Earth. The overwhelming firepower of the Zorvan fleet was their message: surrender, or face annihilation. In those first moments, humanity's defenses crumbled before the Zorvans' might. The best of Earth's military forces struggled to mount any meaningful resistance. The best technologies humanity had developed seemed laughable in comparison to the Zorvans' weaponry. What the world had once considered cutting-edge military hardware was no match for the Zorvans' plasma cannons, energy shields, and advanced targeting systems. The Zorvans had anticipated this. They knew they would face little resistance from a species that had only recently learned to harness the power of the atom. What they hadn't counted on, however, was humanity's unbreakable spirit. Amidst the chaos and destruction, small pockets of resistance began to emerge. It started with small, desperate groups, civilians turned fighters, survivors picking up whatever weapons they could find. There were no grand armies, no high-tech battle formations. It was the spirit of humanity's resilience in its purest form, the will to survive. These initial skirmishes were nothing more than flashes of defiance. Makeshift weapons, stolen Zorvan technology, and hastily built barricades dotted the landscape, but they were enough to show the invaders that humanity was not ready to submit. The Zorvans, so sure of their victory, initially scoffed at the resistance. To them, the human forces were insignificant fragments of an already beaten species. They thought of it as nothing more than a nuisance. They sent out their warships, obliterating anything that dared to stand against them. Yet the human spirit refused to be extinguished. With every blow struck against them, humanity adapted, grew stronger, more resilient. What the Zorvans had failed to understand was that humans were not merely fighters. They were survivors, capable of learning, evolving, and innovating. The first real sign of human ingenuity came from the unlikeliest of sources: a group of engineers and civilians, working in secret, managed to reverse engineer one of the Zorvan ships that had crashed on Earth. The ship was unlike anything they had ever seen. But these survivors, working with limited resources, quickly deciphered its workings. They saw patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities where the Zorvans saw nothing but superiority. Humanity had no vast fleets or advanced weaponry to rival the Zorvans, but it had something far more powerful: adaptability. The human race, desperate to survive, worked relentlessly to improve their technology. They learned how to harness the Zorvan energy sources, how to build weapons that could exploit the vulnerabilities in their enemies' ships. Humanity wasn't winning yet, but it was holding its ground, fighting back with everything it had. Small victories started to accumulate. A downed Zorvan cruiser was scavenged for parts, and soon, humanity was crafting hybrid weapons, half Zorvan, half human-made, that proved devastating in the hands of skilled fighters. The first real battle in the war for Earth had begun. The Zorvans, at first dismissive, now began to realize that they had underestimated their enemies. The human forces, though smaller and under-equipped, were proving resilient. The Zorvans' perfect plan, the one they had meticulously crafted for centuries, was beginning to unravel. The human resistance was not a flash in the pan. It was the spark of a revolution. But even in the face of mounting resistance, the Zorvans refused to back down. They sent in reinforcements, massive ships that blotted out the sky, and unleashed devastating weapons that turned entire cities into nothing more than ruins. But even as Earth burned, humans refused to bow. The once scattered militias began to unify under common banners, and what had started as isolated pockets of resistance became a coordinated effort. Cities that had been destroyed were rebuilt, repurposed as strongholds for those who still fought to defend their homes. Across the planet, pockets of humanity held strong. In the East, in the once glorious cities of Asia, underground bunkers became the last refuge of those who still had hope. In the West, in the wilds of North America, guerrilla fighters used the terrain to their advantage, setting traps and launching surprise attacks on Zorvan patrols. And in Europe, old military bunkers and castles became places of refuge, fortresses for those who still dared to resist. As time went on, the tactics of the Zorvans began to show their weaknesses. Their once flawless strategies were being countered and their supply lines were being cut off. Zorvan commanders, so used to fighting weaker species, struggled to adapt to a humanity that refused to quit. The Zorvans had thought they could break the will of the humans quickly, but now they were finding that Earth was far more difficult to conquer than they had anticipated. And then came the turning point. It began with a series of brilliant attacks orchestrated by human generals, who had learned the art of war through a brutal and bloody education. They studied the Zorvan tactics, reverse-engineered their technologies, and slowly started to turn the tide of battle. The human resistance began to launch coordinated attacks on Zorvan supply lines, striking at key infrastructure, cutting off communication channels, and rendering Zorvan fleets vulnerable. One of the most daring attacks occurred when a group of human fighters, using makeshift stealth technology, infiltrated a Zorvan flagship. They planted explosives deep inside the ship, triggering a chain reaction that crippled its engines and caused a devastating explosion that ripped through its hull. The loss of such a massive vessel sent shockwaves through the Zorvan fleet and provided humanity with an unexpected victory. The psychological impact of this loss was immense, and for the first time, the Zorvans began to question their position. Humanity's ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience had taken a seemingly insurmountable situation and begun to turn it on its head. The tide of war had not fully shifted yet, but the Zorvans were no longer certain of their victory. They began to realize that Earth was not just a target to be conquered, it was a symbol of something far more important, the strength of the human spirit. A force that, in the face of unimaginable odds, could not be crushed. What the Zorvans had failed to recognize in their initial arrogance was that humanity's true strength lay not in its technology, but in its refusal to give up. The Zorvans had assumed that they would break humanity quickly, but now they were learning the hard way that humans were not easily defeated. They fought back not because they had the strongest weapons or the most advanced technology, but because they had something far more powerful, the unyielding will to survive. As the battle for Earth raged on, the Zorvans found themselves facing a force that no weapon or fleet could defeat, the undying resilience of humanity.